Picture this. You are standing on the sun-baked sandstone walls of Delhi. It is the winter of 1299. The air is thick and tastes like copper and dirt. You look toward the northern horizon, and your blood turns to ice. That dark smudge blocking out the sun is not a weather system. It is an ocean of muscle, sinew, and reflex bows. 200,000 Mongol cavalrymen are marching toward your home. You can feel the vibration of 800,000 hooves rattling the marrow in your bones before you even hear the deafening roar of their war drums. These are not raiders looking for gold. These are the apocalyptic horsemen of the Chagatai Khanate, and they have come to wipe your entire civilization off the map. You grip your spear until your knuckles turn white, knowing that the greatest killing machine in human history is about to crash into your city. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the absolute terror of this moment, you have to understand what the Mongol Empire meant in the 13th century. They were not just an army, they were a biological eraser. From the steppes of Asia to the snowy forests of Russia and the burning deserts of the Middle East, no one could stop them. They had dismantled the greatest dynasties on earth, piling up mountains of skulls to send a very simple message: submit or cease to exist. They fought with a hive mind synchronization that made traditional armies look like disorganized mobs. They lived in the saddle, sleeping on horseback, sustaining themselves by drinking the blood of their own mounts when water was scarce. Their composite bows had a draw weight that could snap a normal man's arm, and their arrows could pierce armor from 100 yards away while riding at a full gallop. For decades, the Indian subcontinent had been a frustrating anomaly for the Mongols. They had probed the borders, launched devastating raids, and tested the defenses, but they had never fully committed to swallowing India whole. The Himalayas and the brutal climate were natural fortresses, but in 1299, Qutlugh Khwaja, the ambitious ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, decided he was done playing games. He assembled a force so massive it drained the resources of his entire empire. His objective was clear: march straight to Delhi. Ignore the border forts, cut off all supply lines, and decapitate the Delhi Sultanate in one swift, catastrophic blow. He wanted to burn the city to ashes and salt the earth. He expected to find a panicked city, a weak ruler, and a population ready to drop to their knees. But Qutlugh Khwaja made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the man sitting on the throne in Delhi was a typical medieval king constrained by morals, politics, or fear. Instead, he was marching into the jaws of a man who viewed human life as cheap currency. The ruler waiting for the Mongols was Sultan Alauddin Khalji. Khalji did not inherit his throne through noble succession. He took it by assassinating his own uncle, slicing off his head and parading it on a pike while it was still dripping blood. He embraced a level of ruthlessness that made even his closest advisors shudder. He ruled through absolute terror, employing a secret police force that would torture entire families for a single whispered insult. When the Mongol horde arrived, spreading panic and choking the streets of Delhi with starving refugees, Khalji did not barricade himself in his palace. He did not send envoys to beg for tribute or offer gold to buy his life. His advisors pleaded with him to stay behind the thick stone walls, to let the Mongols starve themselves out in the unfamiliar heat. Khalji refused. He looked at the invincible Mongol war machine and saw only a challenge to his own monstrous ego. He ordered the gates of his city thrown open. He marched his entire army out onto the dusty, sun-baked plains of Kili to fight the Mongols in open combat. It was an act of sheer, unadulterated madness. He was bringing heavily armored war elephants, foot soldiers, and cavalry to face the fastest, deadliest riders on the planet. This is the story of the Battle of Kili. It is a forgotten nightmare where the unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire smashed head first into an immovable object forged by pure cruelty. To understand why the Mongols marched 200,000 men straight into the blistering heat of India, you have to look past the maps and the trade routes. You have to look at the man sitting on the throne of Delhi. Sultan Alauddin Khalji was not a king who inherited a peaceful realm. He was a predator who clawed his way to the top of the food chain, and he did it by shedding so much blood that the streets of his own capital were permanently stained. The Mongols were used to fighting politicians and aristocrats. They were used to kings who would negotiate, surrender, or run away when the horde appeared on the horizon. But Khalji was cut from a different, far darker cloth. He was a sociopath with unlimited resources, a man who looked at the legendary cruelty of the Mongol Empire and decided he could do better. His rise to power set the tone for his entire reign. He did not wait for his uncle, the reigning sultan, to die of old age. He lured the old man into a trap, embraced him, and then had his assassins slice him to pieces. Khalji paraded his uncle's severed head on a spear, letting the blood drip onto the dusty roads as he marched into Delhi. From day one, his message to the world was clear. There are no rules, there is no mercy, and absolute terror is the only currency that matters. He built a surveillance state so suffocating that nobles communicated in sign language out of fear that the walls were listening. But his domestic tyranny pales in comparison to what he did to the Mongols. Years before the massive invasion of 1299, a group of Mongol converts known as the New Muslims had settled within the Delhi Sultanate. During a military campaign, some of these mercenaries mutinied over the distribution of loot. In the medieval world, mutiny was usually punished by executing the ringleaders. That was not enough for Khalji. He wanted to make an example that would echo across generations. He ordered his loyal troops to hunt down the mutineers, but he did not stop there. In an act of staggering barbarity, he ordered the mass arrest of their wives, their mothers, and their children. Women and infants who had absolutely nothing to do with the mutiny were dragged into the public squares of Delhi. Khalji had them thrown into the dirt and then paraded his massive iron-clad war elephants over them, crushing hundreds of innocent families into the mud. This was the man the Mongol Empire was dealing with, but the true horror, the catalyst that brought the full wrath of the Chagatai Khanate down upon India, was Khalji's architectural tastes. Whenever his generals defeated Mongol raiding parties, they did not take prisoners for ransom. Khalji ordered the captives to be systematically slaughtered. He had their heads hacked off, thousands upon thousands of them, and he used those severed heads as building materials. He constructed massive towers of Mongol skulls outside the gates of his city. He mortared them together with mud and clay, creating monuments of rotting flesh and bone that baked in the sweltering Indian sun. The stench of decaying Mongol warriors hung over Delhi like a toxic fog, serving as a gruesome welcome sign to anyone riding down from the northern passes. When word of these skull towers reached the steppes, it sent a shockwave through the Mongol leadership. The Mongols were the ones who built mountains of skulls. That was their psychological weapon, their signature move to terrify the world into submission. To see a sultan in India Stealing their nightmare tactics and using them against Mongol warriors was an insult that could not go unanswered. Qutlugh Khwaja did not march his army south just to conquer a city. He was marching to erase an abomination. The invasion of 1299 was a collision of two absolute horrors. It was a war of extermination where the invaders realized, perhaps for the first time in their history, that the monster waiting for them in the dark was just as hungry and ruthless as they were. When an army of 200,000 Mongols decides to move, it does not look like a military campaign, it looks like a natural disaster. Qutlugh Khwaja did not just bring soldiers, he brought a crawling, consuming ecosystem of violence. Imagine standing in the path of this horde. Before you even see a single banner, the sky turns a bruised, sickening yellow from the dust kicked up by nearly 1 million horses. The rivers run shallow and foul because hundreds of thousands of animals have drank from them and defecated in them. This was the Chagatai Khanate in motion, a beast of muscle and sinew rolling out of the freezing passes of the Hindu Kush and spilling onto the plains of the Punjab. For decades, the Mongols had treated the Indian subcontinent like a giant medieval bank vault. They would ride in, smash a few border towns, grab as much gold, grain, and human livestock as they could carry, and ride back to the steppes before the brutal Indian summer could melt their resolve. But the winter of 1299 was different. Qutlugh Khwaja was not here to rob the bank. He was here to burn the building to the ground and build his own house on the ashes. He issued a command to his generals that sent a very clear, terrifying message about his intentions. They were to ignore the frontier forts. There would be no stopping for sieges, no wasting time starving out small garrisons. They were to ride straight for the jugular, straight for Delhi. This strategy of bypassing strongholds was practically suicidal in standard medieval warfare. Leaving armed enemies in your rear meant your supply lines would be cut. But the Mongols did not use supply lines. They were a self-sustaining organism of destruction. Each warrior brought a string of remounts. When they ran out of rations, they bled their horses, drinking the warm blood mixed with mare's milk while still riding at a full trot. They ate dried meat tenderized under their own saddles. They did not need a logistical tail, which meant they could move at a speed that completely broke the minds of conventional generals. As they carved their way south, they employed a psychological weapon as devastating as their recurve bows: total, unadulterated terror. They did not just defeat the local militias that tried to slow them down, they erased them. Villages were not just conquered, they were flattened. The Mongols practiced a scorched earth policy so absolute that the land behind them looked like it had been sterilized by fire. The message was simple: resistance means extermination. This deliberate brutality served a very specific, tactical purpose. Qutlugh Khwaja wanted to create a tidal wave of panic, and it worked perfectly. As the Mongol war machine chewed its way through the Punjab, millions of terrified civilians realized that staying meant certain death. So they ran. A massive, desperate exodus of humanity flooded south, choking the dirt roads, abandoning their farms and their livelihoods. They had only one place to go: the capital. They poured into Delhi by the hundreds of thousands, bringing with them stories of demons on horseback who drank blood and built mountains out of human skulls. They clogged the streets, sleeping in the gutters, starving in the alleyways. Men and women trampled each other just to get inside the stone walls before the heavy gates were slammed shut. The price of basic grains skyrocketed in hours. The air in Delhi grew thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and pure, contagious fear. Qutlugh Khwaja was weaponizing India's own population against it. He knew that a besieged city packed with panicked, starving refugees would consume its own resources in a matter of days. He was not just marching to fight Alauddin Khalji, he was marching to watch Khalji choke on the sheer weight of his own desperate people. The noose was tightening around Delhi, and the monster on the throne was finally about to come face to face with the architects of the apocalypse. Inside the walls of Delhi, the air did not just smell of fear. It tasted like dysentery, rotting livestock, and the panicked sweat of 1 million trapped bodies. By the time Qutlugh Khwaja and his 200,000 horsemen finally encircled the capital, the city was already tearing itself apart from the inside. The massive influx of refugees fleeing the Mongol scorched earth campaign had swelled Delhi's population to a bursting point. The streets, the alleyways, the courtyards of mosques, and the gutters were packed with starving, dehydrated civilians. The price of basic grain skyrocketed so fast that gold became essentially worthless. People were trading their life savings for a handful of dirty wheat. If the Mongols did not breach the walls, starvation and disease were mathematically guaranteed to kill everyone inside within a matter of weeks. This was exactly what the Mongols wanted. Standard medieval siege warfare usually involved building massive wooden engines, digging trenches, and spending months pounding away at stone walls. The Chagatai Khanate did not have time for that. They preferred to let the enemy do the work for them. Qutlugh Khwaja set up his camp just a few miles from the city gates, cutting off every single supply route, every river access, and every road. He sat back, sharpened his swords, and waited for the pressure cooker of Delhi to explode. He expected the starving peasants to riot, overwhelm the palace guards, and drag their sultan out in chains to beg for mercy. Inside the royal citadel, the atmosphere was less like a command center and more like a hospice for the condemned. Sultan Alauddin Khalji summoned his highest-ranking generals and most trusted advisors for a war council. The room was thick with despair. His chief advisor, a man named Ala-ul-Mulk, stepped forward, trembling. He gave the Sultan the only logical, sane piece of military advice available. He begged Khalji to stay behind the massive stone fortifications. He argued that the Mongols were creatures of momentum and open spaces. If the Delhi army stayed put, avoided direct confrontation, and just waited, the brutal Indian summer would eventually arrive. The heat, the lack of forage for their millions of horses, and the inevitable outbreak of camp diseases would force the Mongols to retreat. It was the textbook strategy for surviving a Mongol invasion. Hide, endure, and outlast. Khalji listened in dead silence. Then he looked at his terrified council and delivered a response that completely defied human self-preservation. He laughed. He told his advisors that a king who hides behind stone like a frightened rat does not deserve to rule an empire. If he cowered in his palace while the Mongols burned his lands and starved his people, the psychological grip he held over his own ruthless kingdom would instantly evaporate. His enemies within the court would assassinate him the moment the Mongols left. For a sociopath like Khalji, looking weak was a fate significantly worse than being tortured to death by steppe nomads. But there was a darker, more tactical genius hiding behind his monstrous ego. Khalji knew that the Mongols thrived on the illusion of invincibility. As long as the world believed they could not be beaten in open combat, they would never stop coming. He realized that surviving this siege was not enough. He had to break the Mongol mind. He had to walk out into the open, look the apocalypse in the eye, and punch it in the teeth. Against the frantic pleading of every military expert in the room, Khalji issued an order that sounded like a mass suicide pact. There would be no defensive siege. The gates of Delhi were not going to be barricaded. They were going to be thrown wide open. He ordered every single soldier, every war elephant, every archer, and every cavalryman to assemble. They were going to march out of the city and meet the greatest mobile killing machine in human history on the flat, dusty plains of Kili, just outside the city limits. It was an inflexible, heavy, traditional, medieval army walking straight into the meat grinder of the Mongol horde. The city watched in absolute horror as their only line of defense marched out the gates, locking the doors behind them, leaving the population to pray for a miracle that no one believed was coming. Walking out onto the plains of Kili was like stepping onto a butcher's block and handing the executioner his cleaver. The geography was entirely wrong for a defensive stand. It was a flat, featureless expanse of sun-baked dirt just outside the capital. There were no mountains to anchor a flank, no rivers to slow a charge, and no forests to disrupt enemy cavalry. For the Mongols, it was a playground. For the Delhi army, it was a graveyard without the holes dug yet. But Sultan Alauddin Khalji did not care about textbook geography. He cared about leverage, and the only leverage he had was mass. To understand the absolute nightmare of facing the Chagatai Khanate in open combat, you have to forget everything Hollywood has taught you about medieval warfare. The Mongols did not line up in neat rows and charge in a glorious romantic clash of steel. They fought like a biological swarm. They operated with a hive mind synchronization, communicating across miles of battlefield using colored flags and whistling arrows. Their primary tactic was a sweeping flanking maneuver designed to envelop the enemy like a suffocating blanket. They would ride just out of reach, showering you with armor-piercing arrows from their composite recurve bows. These weapons had a draw weight that could snap a modern man's arm, capable of driving a shaft through chainmail and bone from 100 yards away. They refused to engage in hand-to-hand combat until you were exhausted, bleeding, and utterly broken mentally. Khalji knew that if his men tried to chase these phantom riders, they would be pulled out of formation, picked apart, and slaughtered within the hour. The only counter to a fluid enemy is a solid brick wall. He organized his massive army into a rigid, impenetrable block. He placed his heavy infantry and cavalry in 3 distinct wings. But the most critical deployment was on the right flank. He placed his most capable commander, Zafar Khan, in charge of this vulnerable position. Zafar Khan was a legendary warrior, a man who had successfully repelled smaller Mongol raids in the past. Naturally, this meant Khalji secretly despised him. In Khalji's deeply paranoid, sociopathic mind, a successful and popular general was just a usurper waiting for an opportunity. Putting Zafar Khan on the right wing, exactly where the Mongols were guaranteed to hit the hardest, was not just a tactical decision, it was a politically convenient suicide mission. Once the lines were drawn, Khalji issued a chilling decree to his entire officer corps. Any commander who moved from his assigned position without a direct, royal order would be immediately beheaded, not demoted, not flogged, beheaded. The discipline of the Delhi army was not held together by patriotism, brotherhood, or loyalty to the crown. It was held together by the absolute terror of the man watching them from the royal canopy in the rear. Imagine standing in that front line. The sheer sensory overload is enough to make a veteran soldier lose his mind. You are choking on the dust kicked up by hundreds of thousands of hooves. The brutal Indian sun is beating down on your iron helmet, turning your armor into a slow cooking oven. The smell of horse sweat, human fear, and dung sits heavy in the stagnant air. And across the plain, less than a mile away, is a dark, undulating tide of muscle and steel that stretches from one horizon to the other. 200,000 Mongols sit in terrifying, unnatural silence. They do not bang their swords on their shields. They do not scream battle cries to hype themselves up. They just sit in the saddle, staring at you, waiting for the signal to begin the human harvest. This was the ultimate staring contest between two apex predators. On one side, the unstoppable momentum of the Asian steppe, a war machine that had liquefied empires from the Pacific coast to Eastern Europe. On the other, a monolithic wall of terrified men anchored to the dirt by the iron will of a tyrant who would rather watch his entire civilization burn than surrender an inch of ground. The air was so thick with tension, it felt like you could strike a match and ignite the sky. The board was set, the trap was laid. Now it was just a matter of who was going to blink first. To understand the sheer kinetic horror of the Battle of Qutlugh, you have to look at the two superweapons colliding on that dusty plain. This was not just a clash of empires, it was a violent collision of two entirely different biological ecosystems of war. On one side you had the Mongol steppe pony. It was small, shaggy and ugly, but it possessed a demonic level of endurance. The Mongol rider and his horse operated as a single, fluid organism. They could pivot at a full gallop, feint a retreat, and fire arrows backward with devastating accuracy. They were the undisputed masters of battlefield geometry, relying on speed and distance to bleed their enemies dry. But Sultan Alauddin Khalji did not bring geometry to Qutlugh. He brought a meat grinder. The Delhi Sultanate fielded the Asian war elephant, and these were not just large animals brought along for intimidation. They were living, breathing siege engines, 10,000 pounds of pure muscle and aggression meticulously modified for human slaughter. The military engineers of Delhi draped these massive beasts in overlapping layers of heavy iron plates and thick chainmail. They bolted massive, curved steel swords to their tusks, and these blades were coated in poison and designed to slice a galloping horse in half with a single, brutal sweep of the head. On the back of the beast sat a fortified wooden tower carrying archers and spearmen, raining death from an impenetrable high ground. Driving this living tank was the mahout, a man who sat right behind the elephant's ears. The mahout carried a heavy iron hook to steer the animal, but he also carried something much darker, a massive iron spike and a heavy mallet. If the elephant was blinded by arrows and went rogue, turning around to crush its own army, the mahout had one final, fatal duty. He was to drive that iron spike directly into the base of the elephant's skull, dropping the 10,000-pound beast instantly. Khalji left absolutely nothing to chance. When the front lines finally slammed into each other, the physics of the battlefield broke down completely. The Mongols attempted their signature opening move. They swept out in massive, coordinated arcs, trying to envelop the rigid Indian formations. They blotted out the sun with thousands of armor-piercing arrows, a tactic that usually shattered the nerve of any traditional army. But the arrows rained down on the elephants and simply bounced off their iron plating like harmless hail. The Mongols quickly realized they had a massive psychological problem. Horses are naturally skittish prey animals. When a Mongol pony caught the terrifying, unfamiliar stench of an armored elephant, its primal brain screamed in pure panic. The legendary discipline of the Mongol cavalry began to crack as their horses bucked, reared, and refused to charge. The ground beneath them rolled and shuddered as Khalji ordered his armored monsters to advance. The collision was a masterpiece of gore. The elephants waded into the Mongol vanguard like ships ploughing through a stormy sea. Speed and agility meant absolutely nothing when a wall of iron and flesh crashed into your lines. The tusk swords did their gruesome work. severing Mongol horses at the knees and spilling the greatest cavalryman in the world into the choking dirt. Once a rider fell, he was instantly pulverized by feet the size of tree stumps. A single casual stomp from a war elephant turned a veteran steppe warrior into a shattered mess of bone and ruined organs. The Mongol hive mind sputtered and stalled. As the screams of dying horses filled the air, the riders of the apocalypse suddenly realized a terrifying truth. They were fighting a force that could not be intimidated, could not be outflanked, and simply did not care how many empires they had conquered before today. To understand the absolute climax of this bloodbath, you have to look at the right flank. You have to look at General Zafar Khan. He is sitting on his armored horse, breathing in the metallic stench of the battlefield, watching the Mongols struggle against the elephant vanguard. He knows exactly why Sultan Alauddin Khalji placed him in this specific spot. It was not a military honor, it was a calculated execution. Khalji expected the Mongol horde to concentrate their terrifying, overwhelming firepower on the right wing. He wanted them to wipe out this flank, solving a major political problem by erasing his most capable and popular general. Zafar Khan has two choices. He can sit in formation, obey the rigid orders of his paranoid sultan, and wait for the Mongols to slowly grind his men into the dirt. Or he can do the one thing the Mongols and his own ruler would never expect. He can embrace the madness. Zafar Khan looks back toward the safety of the royal canopy in the distance. He knows that if he breaks rank and moves without explicit permission, Khalji has promised to sever his head from his shoulders. But in the deafening, earth-shaking roar of Kili, Zafar Khan makes a decision that will echo through centuries of military history. He decides that if he is destined to die in this suffocating dust, it will not be on the Sultan's terms, it will be on his own. He draws his sword, kicks his spurs violently into his warhorse, and orders his entire wing of heavy cavalry to charge. This is not a coordinated tactical maneuver, it is an act of pure, unfiltered rage and insubordination. Thousands of heavy Indian cavalrymen break formation. They accelerate across the sun-baked dirt, screaming at the top of their lungs as they crash directly into the Mongol left flank. The impact is catastrophic. The Mongols are completely unprepared for this level of suicidal aggression. They are accustomed to being the hammer in every single engagement. For the first time in their lives, they are forced to be the anvil. Zafar Khan's heavy cavalry tears through their tightly packed ranks like a solid iron cannonball tearing through a brittle wooden ship. The sheer kinetic force of the Indian charge completely shatters the Mongol line. You have to picture the absolute, suffocating carnage of this moment. Men are not just dying, they are being violently dismantled. The heavy Indian broadswords cleave through hardened leather armor, snapping collarbones and severing arms in showers of crimson. Zafar Khan is at the absolute tip of the spear, fighting like a man possessed by a demon. He is covered in so much blood that his armor is unrecognizable. He is hacking his way deeper and deeper into the Chagatai horde, carving a wide path of mutilated bodies and screaming horses. He pushes forward with such psychotic intensity that he literally drives the Mongol left wing back for over a dozen miles. For a brief, terrifying hour, the invincible horsemen of the apocalyptic Mongol Empire are running for their lives. But as Zafar Khan cuts his way through the retreating enemy, blinded by adrenaline and the intoxicating taste of victory, he makes a fatal mistake. He doesn't look back. In his relentless bloodlust, he has advanced far too far and far too fast. He has completely severed himself from the safety of the main Delhi army. The infantry is miles behind him. Sultan Khalji watches him disappear into the dust, and true to his cold, sociopathic nature, he orders his men to hold their ground. He does not send reinforcements. He leaves Zafar Khan to his fate. And worst of all, Zafar Khan assumes the Mongols are broken. They aren't. They are simply executing the deadliest, most deceptive maneuver in their entire military playbook, the feigned retreat. Zafar Khan hasn't broken their line at all. He has willingly, aggressively ridden straight into a massive, heavily armed trap. The jaws of the Mongol war machine are about to snap shut. The brilliance of the Mongol feigned retreat is that it does not look like a military maneuver. It looks like absolute chaotic panic. For 18 miles, General Zafar Khan chased what he thought was a broken army. His heavy war horses, carrying hundreds of pounds of armor and men, were pushed past their physical limits. Their lungs burned, their mouths frothed with bloody foam, and their legs grew heavy in the suffocating Indian dust. Zafar Khan was high on the adrenaline of achieving the impossible. He thought he was routing the Chagatai Khanate. He had no idea he was running headfirst into a meat grinder. Suddenly a single, high-pitched whistling arrow sliced through the sky above the fleeing Mongols. In a fraction of a second, the panic vanished. The chaotic mob of retreating horsemen pivoted with a terrifying hive-mind synchronization. They did not just stop running, they wheeled around and fanned out, creating a massive, suffocating crescent of muscle and wood. And then, from the dust clouds on the left and the right, tens of thousands of fresh Mongol cavalrymen materialized. They had been waiting just out of sight, using the curvature of the earth and the blinding dust as camouflage. Zafar Khan pulled his exhausted horse to a halt. The deafening roar of the chase was replaced by the eerie, synchronized sound of 30,000 composite bows being drawn back at once. He was completely surrounded. The Mongols did not charge in for a glorious melee. They were surgeons of death, and they preferred to work from a distance. They initiated a rotating circle of fire, riding in a continuous loop around the trapped Indian cavalry, pouring a relentless, localized hurricane of armor-piercing arrows into the tight formation. The physical reality of being caught in this kill box is beyond human comprehension. You cannot fight back. You can only listen to the sickening crunch of hardened steel, punching through iron chainmail, splintering bone, and puncturing lungs. The Indian heavy cavalry, invincible just an hour ago, was reduced to a stationary target practice. Men and horses were pinned to the dirt, writhing in agony as the arrows blotted out the sun. Qutlugh Khwaja, the Mongol commander, watched this slaughter from a safe distance. He was a ruthless warlord, but he recognized apex military insanity when he saw it. He was genuinely astounded by Zafar Khan's sheer, suicidal bravery. According to the chronicles, he actually ordered a brief pause in the execution. He sent a messenger into the circle of corpses, offering Zafar Khan a position in the Mongol Empire if he surrendered. It was a rare gesture of respect from a force that usually only offered death. Zafar Khan looked at the messenger, looked at his decimated unit, and gave his answer. He refused. He knew his sultan had abandoned him. He knew he was breathing his final breaths, but he was determined to make the Mongols pay in blood for every second he stayed alive. When his horse was finally killed beneath him, shot so full of arrows it looked like a grotesque porcupine, Zafar Khan did not fall to his knees. He drew his sword, planted his boots in the blood-soaked dirt, and fought on foot. He and his surviving men threw themselves at the Mongol lines in a final, rabid frenzy. They were systematically, brutally erased from existence. By the time the dust settled, Zafar Khan and his entire wing of heavy cavalry were completely annihilated. The right flank of the Delhi army was gone. On paper, it was a flawless tactical execution by the Mongols. But as Qutlugh Khwaja rode through the field of mutilated bodies, the atmosphere in the Chagatai camp was not triumphant. It was profoundly shaken. The Mongols had just watched a single Indian general, betrayed by his own king and completely cut off from reinforcements, carve through their invincible vanguard and fight to the last drop of blood without a shred of fear. The psychological armor of the Mongol horde was cracked. They had won the skirmish, but as the sun began to set over the plains of Kili, a terrifying realization crept into the Mongol ranks. If this was how a betrayed, isolated Indian general fought, what kind of demonic nightmare was waiting for them in the main army tomorrow? Night falls over the plains of Kili, and the true horror of medieval warfare sets in. A battlefield does not simply go quiet when the sun goes down. It becomes a pitch-black choir of absolute misery. Tens of thousands of mutilated men and horses are bleeding to death in the dirt, crying out for water in the freezing darkness. In the Mongol camp, the fires are lit, but the atmosphere is completely wrong. This is the mighty Chagatai Khanate. They are supposed to be celebrating the total annihilation of the Indian right wing. Instead, a suffocating, deeply unsettled silence hangs over the leather command tents. They have finally looked into the eyes of the Delhi army, and they have seen a terrifying reflection of their own ruthlessness. To make matters infinitely worse, the Mongol command structure is collapsing from the inside out. Sometime during the chaotic, desperate melee with Zafar Khan's heavy cavalry, the Mongol supreme leader, Qutlugh Khwaja, was critically wounded. The exact nature of the lethal strike is buried in the ashes of history, but the result was undeniable. The warlord who had dragged 200,000 horsemen across the freezing passes of the Hindu Kush to burn the world was now lying in his tent, coughing up blood and rapidly fading. The Mongols were apex predators, but their entire military machine operated on the absolute, unquestioned strength of their Khan. A dying leader in hostile territory, cut off from any hope of reinforcement, was a catastrophic vulnerability. Now look across the blood-soaked killing field at the royal canopy of the Delhi Sultanate. The contrast is utterly terrifying. Sultan Alauddin Khalji has just watched his most capable general get butchered. He has lost a massive percentage of his heavy cavalry. By all conventional military metrics, his right flank is entirely exposed and his army is bleeding. And yet Khalji is practically glowing. In his deeply paranoid, sociopathic mind, the day has been a spectacular, calculated success. He just used the Mongol horde as a meat grinder to execute his only political rival, Zafar Khan, without ever getting his own hands dirty. He does not send a recovery party to find his general's body. He does not mourn. He sleeps soundly, perfectly prepared to feed every remaining man in his army to the elephants the very next morning. Inside the Mongol War Council, the surviving generals are doing the grim, cold mathematics of survival. The Mongols are not romantic knights who fight to the last drop of blood for the glory of a crumbling ideal. They are businessmen of death. They calculate leverage, risk, and reward. The reward is the unimaginable wealth of Delhi, but the risk has suddenly become completely unmanageable. Their steppe ponies are fundamentally terrified of the ironclad Indian war elephants. Their legendary armor-piercing arrows bounce harmlessly off the thick iron plating of those beasts. And, worst of all, the man sitting on the throne of Delhi is a madman who views his own soldiers as entirely disposable currency. If one isolated, betrayed Indian general could inflict this much psychological and physical damage, What would a full-scale frontal assault against Khalji's main body look like tomorrow? The math no longer makes sense. The cost of doing business is simply too high. In the dead of night, the unstoppable force makes an unthinkable decision. They decide to run away, but you cannot simply march a massive, wounded army away from a battlefield without the enemy noticing and cutting you down from behind. The Mongols are forced to execute a phantom retreat. They pile heavy wood onto their campfires, building massive, roaring blazes that light up the night sky. This creates the perfect visual illusion that the entire horde is resting and preparing for a dawn offensive. Then they wrap the hooves of their surviving horses in thick cloth to muffle the sound. In total, humiliating silence, the greatest military machine on the planet turns its back on Delhi. They leave the prize behind and vanish into the darkness, carrying their dying Khan with them. When the sun finally rises over Kili, the Delhi army is standing in rigid formation. The infantry is gripping their spears, sweating in the morning heat, bracing for the sky to turn black with arrows. The Mahouts are feeding their armored elephants, ready to charge head first into the apocalypse. But as the morning mist burns away, they stare at an empty horizon. There is no army. There are only the smouldering ashes of abandoned campfires and the rotting corpses of yesterday's slaughter. Against all odds, logic, and sanity, the unbreakable Mongol Empire has blinked. The morning sun illuminates a landscape of absolute ruin. The Battle of Kili is over, but there is no glorious celebration in the streets of Delhi. There are no parades for the victorious dead. Sultan Alauddin Khalji does not write poetic speeches about freedom or the resilience of the human spirit. He simply orders the battlefield cleared, the weapons salvaged, and the skull towers outside his city reinforced with fresh Mongol heads. He has done the impossible. He has broken the spine of the Chagatai Khanate, but he did not do it to save India. He did it because he refused to share his slaughterhouse with anyone else. To understand the true weight of this moment, you have to strip away the morality we try to force onto history. If Qutlugh Khwaja had won at Kili, the Indian subcontinent would have been subjected to a demographic catastrophe. The Mongols would have burned Delhi to ashes, slaughtered its millions of refugees, and turned the fertile plains of the Ganges into grazing land for their horses. The rich, complex tapestry of Indian history that followed, the rise of new empires, the synthesis of cultures, the architecture that defines the subcontinent today, would have been violently aborted. The Mongol war machine would have simply swallowed another civilization whole. But they failed because they finally met a man whose capacity for cruelty matched their own. Alauddin Khalji was not a hero. He was a deeply paranoid, sociopathic tyrant who murdered his own family, crushed innocent women and children under the feet of his war elephants, and deliberately sent his bravest general on a suicide mission out of sheer political jealousy. He ruled through absolute, suffocating terror. Yet in the brutal mathematics of the 13th century, that exact terror is what saved the subcontinent. The Mongols operated on the principle of psychological dominance. Khalji defeated them not just with armored elephants and rigid formations, but by proving that his madness was deeper, darker, and more unyielding than theirs. History loves to give us clean narratives of good triumphing over evil, of noble kings defeating dark lords. But the Battle of Kili forces us to look at a much more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the monster is the only thing standing between you and the apocalypse. Sometimes salvation does not come riding on a white horse with a banner of righteousness. Sometimes it comes sitting on an armored beast, wielding a poisoned blade, completely willing to sacrifice everything and everyone just to watch the enemy bleed. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this dark chapter of history fascinated you, please give this video a like and make sure you are subscribed with the bell notification turned on. We are building a library of history's most incredible forgotten moments, and I want you to be part of it. I also want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Alauddin Khalji was a necessary evil or simply a tyrant who got lucky against an overconfident enemy? Let the debate begin. If you want to dive deeper into the tactics that made the Mongols so terrifying before their defeat in India, click the video on your screen right now to see how they annihilated other empires. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past, it is a warning for the future.